From New York Times Opinion, this is The Ezra Klein Show. And now for something completely different. We recorded this episode right before the first presidential debate, and there's been such a crush of political news since then that there hasn't really been a moment that felt right to release it. But I loved this conversation, and in a funny way, it's more relevant now given how much the election has come to revolve around the reasons people do and don't have children and the meaning of that choice. So a few months ago, Gia Tolentino published a big piece in The New Yorker on Cocomelon. Cocomelon, if you do not have a 2-year-old, is a show that every really little kid really loves, and every parent has a more complicated set of emotions about. But it's something Tolentino wrote at the end that was what really caught my eye. She said, "I found myself wondering if we'd be better off thinking less about educational value in children's media and more about real pleasure, both for us and for our kids." In a way, this is an episode about real pleasure, which is not what I went into it thinking it would be about. It's about the tension between pursuing pleasure, or what I might call meaning, and pursuing the kinds of achievements we spend most of our lives being taught to prize. Honestly, I think this gets much more to the heart of the questions people ask about having children than all this political rhetoric about cat ladies and extra votes and tax rates. And I don't think it's an accident that in this conversation, as we're trying to talk about the value of what we can't measure against the value of what we can, we end up finding ourselves in the language of religion, of psychedelics, of emotion. These are questions where I think we've culturally lost some of the vocabulary that we used to have to talk about just what it means to live a good life. Not to have a higher income or a better job, but what is a good life? Gia Tolentino is the author of the great book of essays Trick Mirror, one of my favorite books about being alive in the age of the internet. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker. And as always, my email is ezrakleinshow@nytimes.com. Gia Tolentino, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
So you told me that you came to a new understanding of why you had children on your way to tape today outside the Port Authority, and you would tell it to me when we were on the show. So why did you have children?
I was thinking on the train up here about that question, like, why did I have kids? And I was thinking about my trepidation beforehand. And, I feel like I bring back every conversation about children to a conversation about psychedelics, unfortunately. But the idea seemed scary and overwhelming in the same way that doing acid seemed scary and overwhelming before I did it for the first time. It was like, oh, this is going to last for so long. There's going to be part of it that's so intense and so difficult. And I didn't do it until I felt like I know that the person that I'm going to do it with, I'll have fun with. I can trust that I'm doing it in kind of like a safe and right environment where I will get the thing that I want out of it. But the thing that made me decide to do acid for the first time is like not dissimilar to the thing that made me decide to have kids, which is like, I think it'll be fun. I think on the whole, I think it'll be fun. I felt that there would be real, lasting, kind of destabilizing, kind of boundary dissolving pleasure in it that would kind of scare me in the way that true pleasure kind of does. And I really hadn't thought about it that neatly until you said that we wanted to talk about this. Like, I don't think I understood that really the thing that drove me to this was probably the thing that drives me to a lot of things, which is pleasure seeking.
It's funny because I sometimes use the psychedelics and Parenthood analogy, but I use it in a very different way, which is people will tell me they're struggling with the decision and they're reading the parenting books. And I always say that to read the parenting books it's like the difference between reading about doing psychedelics and doing psychedelics.
Right.
And that the fun is not the point. I have this discomfort with the discourse around fun in parenting, as if the way to measure any experience in your life is whether when you're filling out a time use survey, you're having a lot of fun doing it.
Right.
When I've done psychedelics, I don't necessarily think they're fun. Sometimes they are, but what brings me to them is meaning.
Right.
And I feel like what brought me to parenting, or what attracted me to it, what made it seem like not even a question to me, was that I want meaning in my life.
Right.
And what is a more fundamental sense of human meaning than continuing the sort of human chain?
Well, I should say too, when I say fun, I think that's why I corrected myself. Like what I think of as fun is it's much less like enjoyment and more like pushing the limits of what I don't know, can stand or am capable of. Like I have a kind of arduous idea of fun. Like something that I long to do constantly is like go to Antarctica and completely lose my mind. Like that sounds like one of the most fun things I can imagine. And so doing psychedelics, it is extremely challenging sometimes and not always fun, but that is a specific kind of pleasure that the definition of which is very close to finding meaning.
One thing that's very clear to me as your work has shifted towards thinking a lot about parenting, I think since you've become a parent, is that you find it really interesting. Like it's very intellectually generative for you. I find that's true for me. I think that the thing I always say to people about parenting that was surprising to me is how interesting it is. It was really undersold to me, how just kind of it would focus my mind on things I would have never thought of or never thought of at that depth before. You've written one of my favorite lines about parenting. And you wrote it in this piece about Angela Garba's book and about your own experience hiring a nanny. And you wrote, quote, "We could afford to do this because a person can get paid more to sit in front of her computer and send a bunch of emails than she can to do a job so crucial and difficult that it seems objectively holy, to clean excrement off a body, to hold a person while they're crying, to cherish them because of and not despite their vulnerability." Tell me about the choice of the word holy there.
It's the part of this is because the way I was raised deep in the evangelical church in Texas, but that's the only word for it. It's, we were talking about fun, we were talking about pleasure, now we're talking about this idea of the sacred, right? And I think that for me, the thing connecting all of those is like some sort of submission and disappearance into something, right? Like it's the total submission to someone else's body, really, in your baby, that I found there's no other word for it. And to their body's needs and to the mess of it and there's no other word. And it also feels the same way with the parts of parenting that are in fact tedious and repetitive and so mundane, which is often the exact same stuff, right? Like wiping a butt over and over again and like wiping spit up from somebody's mouth and washing tiny little hands, right? Like these things are so often tedious and they are holy. And the thing that connects them both, like it's submission. And I found that like the transcendent moments in parenting and the really like just objectively boring ones, where I'm like laying on the floor of my living room wishing I could read a book instead of just like stacking little plastic eggs on each other. It feels like the same project. And I have found parenting really interesting. And I think by the time I decided to try to do it, I figured it would be, right? Like figured it would be in the same way that I was like, no matter what, like as with my first acid trip, I was like, no matter what, this will be interesting. Like no matter what, this will be extremely difficult in a way that is interesting. How could it not?
I think there's so much tension and energy and guilt in this connection between the sacred and the mundane. The sense that you often should be feeling you are so close to this transcendent experience. You're doing the most meaningful thing and you're so bored or so tired or you so want to be somewhere else. What do you do when what you're trying to do is escape the thing you should be paying attention to? And it's such a profound,
right.
Constant experience in parenting, but also in life.
In life.
Right? To be alive is also holy. To be alive, to be able to experience this at any moment, right? The possibility of connection, of experience, of just being in this world, it should be so overwhelming. And instead, I am staring at my phone.
Yeah. I started laughing when you were talking about that because I was just thinking about, like my little baby's about to turn 1. And so it's like, I just instantly thought back to, I don't know, days when she was like 4 months old. And those days when it's like 9:30 a.m. and you're like, I wish everyone would go to bed. Anyone ever have those days? And I would feel when I had that thought, right? Like, be tired from getting up in the middle of the night, whatever it was. And I was just like, can everyone just go to bed now so I can like not speak and not do anything and not learn and not play or whatever. And I would have the thought, like, I'm abrogating the whole purpose of being alive, right? Like I could actually just enjoy this pushing the swing in the sunshine over and over and over. But instead, I just want to look at some dumb shit on my phone and, whatever. And I don't know, have you ever had this experience? I think back to when I was little and, I would read books while I was on roller skates. Like, I don't think that the quality of wanting to leap out of the texture of the present is something that's specific to the smartphone era. Like, I remember, I read in the bathtub. Like, I just always, you memorize the shampoo bottles. Like, you're always kind of looking for a narrative to take you out of the present. And I remember that being something that was true for me as a really little kid, even as I was someone and remained someone that I was very present and I did have a great time all the time, pretty much. But I do think that the way that the smartphone has sort of deformed and, put that desire like quivering in our pockets, like beckoning to us. Like I was going to say, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I have this sort of symptom of this brain disease that's particularly troubling to me is like pre-kids, back when I had enough alone time to have like original thoughts, more than once every 5 months or something. Like I would think something and I would have the sense of like, this is an idea that is like shimmering with movement in some way, and then it would be too much for me. And then I would be like, I can't deal with it. Like I'm going to write it down and then I'm going to scroll for 5 minutes. Like I would very frequently have that response. And that terrified me, even though I kept having it. And it sometimes feels to me not that we're turning away from the like mess and the wonder of real physical experience, despite the fact that it's precious. I kind of feel something within me sometimes that it's too precious. It's too much. Being present is work in a way that it's this like rawness and it's this mutability. It requires this of us and a presence. Like that is something that I have sometimes found myself like flexing away from because of all the reasons that it's good in a weird way. Do you know what I mean at all?
I absolutely know what you mean.
Yeah.
In a million different ways. I was a kid. Why do I read? Now I think it's almost a leftover habit, but I read to escape. I read to escape my world. I read to escape my family. I read to escape things I didn't understand. And I read because obsessively, constantly, all the time, in cars, in the bathroom, anywhere.
Totally.
Because it was a socially sanctioned way to be alone.
Right.
And nobody would bother me because it was virtuous for me to be reading. One of the things I was thinking about while you were saying that was there's more spiritualism in this conversation than I expected, but I'm enjoying it. And it feels a little bit like our metaphors are shaped by different traditions, right? I know you grew up deeply Christian, and there's a sense in the way you think about it and write about it, the holiness, the awe of all creation, right? This sort of the external world that requires something of you. And a lot of my experience of this or thinking about it is shaped more from meditation and mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that I was thinking about while you were saying that was what always feels limited to me is my attention. And a lot of the need to escape is a need to rest my attention and recharge it.
Right.
And what allows me to access the transcendence of my children, of the world, is honestly how rested and how awake and aware I am. I spent some time in a coffee shop before coming here to talk to you, and I just needed that time listening to music and reading so my attention could recover, so I could be present here with you. So in that way, I think escape is under-theorized. That escape, it can be good or bad. I think we have trouble with this question of, are we distracting ourselves or are we recovering?
Right.
Are we getting a kind of necessary contemplation so that we can come back and experience the world and process what we've experienced and seen?
Right.
Or are we running from it? Are we trying not to feel from it? Are we trying to be anywhere but here?
Or are we looking for something, right? Like, are we looking? Because I think that a lot of what takes people to screens is like, it's it looks like escape, but I think it's also pursuit. A friend of mine was watching my baby when, it was one of those like schools off, whatever, Andrew's out of town, whatever. And And I was saying, like, okay, before you put her down for a nap, like rock her in the rocking chair, give her a couple minutes. And then once she's, once you see the eyes blink really heavy, just dump her. And they were like, oh, that's her phone scrolling time. And I was like, yeah, that's her phone scrolling time, like her brain just needs to, like, sometimes we're just putting our brain on the static signal.
I think this is a place where there's so much self-judgment, right? Are you escaping? Are you recovering? And then we put that judgment also on our children. And this gets us to Cocomelon. Why don't you describe for someone who has never seen it and has no idea what that word means, what is Cocomelon?
So Cocomelon is one of the most successful entertainment franchises of all time, like not just for children. And yet it's something that, like, if you haven't changed a diaper in the last 4 years, you probably have no idea that it exists,
Beans, beans, it's time to eat your beans.
Yes, 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 I want to eat the beans.
Good, good, beans are good for you.
Yay, 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 I love them. Ooh.
How to put this? The backdrop of Cocomelon is that major children's animation companies did not make entertainment for babies and young toddlers because this was seen as sort of like unethical, and kids can't really learn from a screen at that age, so we're not going to do it. And then YouTube was invented, and then the iPad was invented, and suddenly iPad parenting, of which I certainly take part in, was instantiated as like the way that suddenly we were all living. I think half of 2 to 5-year-olds have their own mobile devices, which again, my 4-year-old is one of them. And then so just this land was wide open, this like pristine farmland of just millions and millions and millions and millions of children whose attention could then be captured and monetized. And then you get all these things, like people know Miss Rachel probably.
Hey. Hello. Can you say mama? Mama. Mama. Let's sing it. Mama. Let's clap it. Mama. Let's sign it. Mama. Good job.
But then there were all of these nursery rhyme channels where you would get just sing-song nursery rhymes and kind of squeaky-looking, mesmerizing, uncanny animation of just giant bobble-headed, like eternally smiling babies and like perfect little worlds where the sun is always shining and the parents are always around, and it's rainbow popsicles and it's fort building and just smiles and smiles and smiles and smiles, and the same words repeated over and over and over and over, and bright clanging noises, and like these things that are torturous for adults but basically heavenly to whatever is going on in our babies' brains.
Wash my hair, do-do-do-do-do. Wash my hair, do-do-do-do-do. Wash my hair, do-do-do-do-do. Wash my hair. Wash my face, do-do-do-do-do. Wash my face, do-do-do-do-do.
Cocomelon is like, it's so popular that, as of some time ago, the daily viewers was like 80 million daily viewers, which is as many people as watched the 2016 presidential debate between Trump and Clinton. And that's just everyday viewers. And I think a conservative estimate would be that it's watched for 200 billion minutes a year. And it's just, all the more remarkable because most of those viewers are basically pre-verbal. I've learned much more about Cocomelon than I ever thought I was going to.
There's something interesting in Cocomelon, and I assume this maybe partially motivated your inquiry into it. There are two of them, I think, really, Cocomelon and Blippi, but we'll focus on Cocomelon, that exist at this absolute tension point of children adore it and adults hate it. There are other things adults don't mind, right? Sesame Street, actually, most adults like. They remember it. We remember it. I enjoy it. You can't really get that many kids to watch Mr. Rogers now, but if you can, but parents like Daniel Tiger. There's all kinds of stuff that parents love. Bluey, I think in general, parents like Bluey more than their kids like Bluey.
Right.
But Cocomelon is this one where from a very young age, your children go, and I feel like you could describe this two ways: completely vacant or completely focused in front of it, right? It's either an experience of being totally filled or totally empty, and I can never quite tell which. And parents just, it drives them mad. Why this one? Why do you feel like there's this like unfathomable divergence between what the kids want here and what the parents want here?
Well, I think as far as I can make sense of it, this is the first sort of, like Cocomelon ushered in a paradigm where children's entertainment is not configured as entertainment, but as just raw attentional capture. And I think that that's why, right? Like it's the people that work on it or that worked on it, they've been laying people off like crazy despite these viewing numbers and the $3 billion like parent company valuation. But, I do think that the people that create it are interested in providing like pleasure and entertainment for the people that watch it. But the project of this company is attentional capture. And obviously there's significant overlap between attentional capture and entertainment. But I do think that we can, and now I kind of think we should meaningfully differentiate them, maybe especially for kids. And I think that's why, like, I think you can feel it in the sort of bones of the stuff and the reaction parents have to it, Like even like Teletubbies, like college students love like coming down from drugs and watching Teletubbies. Like even like silly baby entertainment, it can provide delight, which is not saying any of this has ever been pure, right? Like it's children's television has basically always existed as like an eternal toy commercial. But even like G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, these basically, way back, Mickey Mouse Club, whatever, all of these things, they were configured as entertainment first. And there's something about this that doesn't feel like it's configured as entertainment first. It feels like it's just eyeball capture, like just mining attention with a pickaxe into the parent's eyes, yeah.
How much do you think the parental anger at Cocomelon, and I will very much include myself here, is a kind of self-loathing, though?
100%.
I love the line you said, not entertainment, but raw attentional capture. And two things really jump out at me from that. One is that when you're putting 18-month or 2-year-old in front of Cocomelon, you're usually doing it for a reason. You desperately have to get something done around the house. Their older brother is sick. You're on a plane, right? There's a reason you're doing it. And what you're doing is trying to create raw attentional capture. If it did not completely capture them, it would not be serving the instrumental purpose you are using it for. I mean, they're too young for entertainment, really, at least in the way we think about it in culture. So one, it's like we have asked this thing to provide a service and we are mad at how well it provides it.
Right.
And then two, there is this creepy analogy to ourselves. I mean, how much that we absorb and consume is not entertainment, but raw attentional capture. How well does that describe parts of Instagram or TikTok or even television that we binge knowing that it has almost no nourishment to it,
right?
But we just don't want to think. We are asking it to provide an instrumental service, which is make the time go faster and make me disembodied because I don't want to be here right now having my holy life.
Right.
I want to be completely absorbed in, something else, something outside of myself.
Yeah. So one thing about Cocomelon, right? It's not, like you said, they're not doing anything new. It's just that the audience is new, right? Like I talked to former writers who were telling me that they got a spreadsheet of all of the search words that toddlers were making their parents type in on YouTube Kids or whatever, and they would write episodes to those search terms, right? It was an extremely SEO-targeted operation, and everything that I see has been algorithmically tailored to exactly what I want to be looking at as well, And I think I will say, like, I don't have that much screen time anxiety about my kids, right? I'm like, y'all have plenty of resources, Like you were creative class children in Brooklyn. Like you are luckier than 99% of the global population. Like you're going to be fine. I don't care about your like specific like language. I don't know. Like I don't worry about screen time in a very specific way, but I have a preemptive sorrow about the way that like any ill can be instantly evaporated by putting my phone in front of my toddler and letting her, or not my toddler anymore, like my 4-year-old, and letting her text emojis to my partner all day, another one of my distraction tactics. I get the sense that you're going to be looking at screens so much. You're going to be doing everything that I'm doing, but probably by hours and hours worse. And you, like me, are going to be unable to be just present without reaching for your phone after a certain number of minutes, probably, right? And you are your conception of what is possible is going to be limited to what is presented to you on that screen, and your conceptions of what you want. And, I feel like all of that screen time anxiety that I feel about her comes from my own sense that screens have already foreclosed a lot of that, negative capability in my own life.
I want to expand on a line you gestured at there when you talked about what are we afraid of? And this is one of the places your piece really connected for me. I have this feeling, as I said earlier, that we're underspecified on what we want and what we don't want. And you're right, when it comes to the shows we allow our children to watch, we are afraid of what exactly? That our kids' capacity for deep thought will be blunted by compulsive screen use, that they'll lose their ability to sit with the plain fact of existence, to pay attention to the world as it is, to conceive of new possibilities, that they'll grow up to be just like us, only worse. And those all feel like things we're afraid of. And also maybe that they will never know any different. And I wonder about this, right? I mean, my kids, like, they will never remember a time before YouTube Kids, right? They didn't exist in a time before YouTube Kids. There has always been escape. There's always been distraction. And the fact that it was not that good, I think, was important.
Right.
And I have trouble describing this. And I have trouble then like making the distinctions based on it. But it's like, I want my children to be able to escape the difficulty of reality. I think it's important. I do it too. But somehow I know when I do it in certain ways, it's bad for me. And when I do it in other ways, it's good for me. Like, I don't know why it is bad for me to look at my phone and good for me to read a magazine, but it is. And I can't put it on a chart for you.
Can you not? It's because one is surveilled and the other isn't, right? Like,
I don't think I care about the surveillance.
You don't? But don't you think that's why one feels better than the other? You feel freer doing one than the other. Like, you don't feel your choices being sort of actively manipulated and shaped and constrained by like an extremely bald, like, profit structure. Like, that to me feels, like you said, the escape was worse, but it also was an escape, right? Like, we were in our books in the back of the car and nobody knew what was happening and what we were reading except for us. Our parents would never know. There was no machine record of it whatsoever. Even like if we were writing, right? Like if we were doing the equivalent of sort of what is, I think, widely and rightfully configured as unhealthy, like the 11-year-old girl on Instagram, right? Like the way I was processing my life in narrative or whatever, where the way I was writing my life into its existence was in a notebook where no one could see it and no one would ever profit from escalating or distorting it or testing it against anything. And so much of that seems tied for me to the lack of silent, invisible, constant surveillance.
So, and I mean this completely sincerely, I love how much that doesn't resonate for me at all. Because
Really?
it means that I'm having such a different experience of this. And so I want to have them both here. Because one, I'm so close to a phone vegan. I'm so unbelievably annoying about what I have on my phone. So virtually nothing on my phone even can surveil me at this point.
Do you not have a browser?
I have a browser, but I don't use it that much, except literally to look at Pitchfork music reviews, which is one of my favorite time-wasting activities. But I have a lot of, like I have the New Yorker app. I'm unbelievably annoying as a person. But for me, the thing that I notice about a magazine, which I think is my favorite form of media, like full stop, is there is room for me to get interested and absorbed and let my attention move away from where I am at that moment. But it is not so absorbing or so grasping that my attention can't shift back, that I've fully lost track of my body or my surroundings. And I think this is one of the things that I want to get at. I am unnerved by how much we feel the need to net everything out, whether culture is good or bad, to these very measurable outcomes about, school achievement or income in 20 years or teen mental health. And it feels to me like we've just lost the ability to make judgments based on sort of virtues and values about when things are good and bad, like whether it is better to read a book or look at TikTok, irrespective of
Studies.
Whether that shows up into
studies of educational achievement. Yeah,
exactly. I feel like we have lost self-confidence in making cultural judgments, like for ourselves, for society, as parents. We are so achievement-oriented. I feel like you see this in the debate about John Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, that if we cannot show something on a chart, it's like we cannot have the self-confidence to make a judgment about it.
Well, I think, so I was going to pitch you another possible reason why the magazine feels different from the phone, which is that, the phone, it is always entwined with usefulness, and like your work email lingers. I mean, you are reachable to be useful to someone when you were looking at your phone, even if you're just reading the same book on your Kindle that you would be reading off of it, right? Like, I think real pleasure, you're not, like, there's nothing quantifiably achieved in it. Like, you are not just unsurveilled, but you are not being useful to a goddamn person, except the person directly in front of you, if there is one, right? Or the people, the many people. And that has to do with what you're talking about, the sort of Emily Oster-esque, not knocking her, I subscribe to her Substack, like the reduction of everything to like, what does the data say? And, what are the outcomes? And that's the choice, right? It's sort of maybe like an intellectual inadequacy in my own life that causes me to come back to this, but it's like, does it feel good or does it not? And I think we still know what feels good and bad. And I think that's a good of a metric to judge anything on for ourselves and our kids to some extent, right?
I think that really helps me describe or realize something. I want to go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, this question of what are you afraid of for your children specifically? And I think maybe that gets at it. The reason I like magazines and don't like my phone is not surveillance or anything else. It's that I feel better when I read a magazine. There are a million reasons for that. And I would probably describe it as my attention is more collected and centered and stable afterwards. And so I can then attend to other things in my life better and with more joy. But it's just, I feel better. I like it. It's more pleasurable. And I think the thing that I worry about, the thing that I'm afraid of is, I wanted to bring children into the world, not because the world is perfect but it is beautiful. And I feel like I got this gift of getting to experience it. And I want them to have this gift of getting to experience it, in its wonderful dimensions and its horrors. And I am worried that I have unleashed a set of technologies upon them, and that we've done this socially, that is going to structurally and permanently degrade their capacity for that experience in the way that I notice it degrading mine in the moment. And I'm frustrated at myself for not being better at policing. But them, they're young and they're getting tuned and trained and wired, or whatever metaphor you want here. And I think the thing I am afraid of is not like their grades will be bad because they watched Ninjago or Ninjago. It is that their experience of the world will be thinner and more scattered because they will have been trained on these hyper stimulating things that somehow absorb you at the same time they make you feel bad. And that will just become the sort of baseline of what attention is supposed to be like.
So they'll be like us, right? Like, they will have their experience of the world curtailed by the desire to check a device every however many seconds, right? Like they will. There's just no doubt about it. It'll probably be a lot worse for them. But hopefully, like us too, they will have found the things in the world that they can be devoted to in a way that supersedes at least a certain amount of time the screen, right? Like the only way that I see out of this for my children is the only way that I see out of this for myself is like, I can't be disciplined. I can't spend X amount of minutes less per day on my phone because I know it's bad for me how much I'm on there already. I can't, like, it's only when the real physical world is brighter and more colorful and full of surprises. And, luckily I found something that holds my attention more than phones do. I found, a certain set of things that,
Psychedelics.
Well, certainly psychedelics. Going out dancing, being, face to face with a friend, across, like reading, writing, right, listening to music. Actually, this extremely limited set of things that are more mesmerizing to me and more pleasurable to me than the screen. That's like one of my very few concrete hopes that I have for my kids is that they find something that makes the world's dimensions enlarge in a way that overmatches however the world enlarges or seems to enlarge through a screen.
I want to get at how you're getting there, because I think there's something very deep in this question between attending to pleasure or attending to some joyful or meaningful dimension of experience and attending to, some of these other ends. You talk in the piece about a researcher, and this is to cast no aspersions on the work she does, which sounds both necessary and annoying, who has done all this research trying to rate these different children's shows according to how educational they are. And so you have Daniel Tiger, and that gets a 2. It's a very weird 0 to 2 scale. But you have something like Daniel Tiger, which is an offshoot of the Mr. Rogers cinematic universe, which gets a 2. Or maybe Bluey would probably get a 2. You have something like Cocomelon, which gets a 1, not very educational, but not like actively meant to be harmful and frightening. And then you have the strange underbelly of YouTube Kids, this sort of computer-generated, AI-animated, often kind of horrifying, like dream logic, crap CGI, and that's like a 0. And I was thinking, reading that, about what is implicit in the scale, which is that the best thing should be the most educational thing. And I don't really believe that for myself. I'm not sure I believe it for children, but I think there is this question we face of, well, what is our measure? But what for you helps orient the tuning fork, both like for Gia or for your children?
I think within this question and this calculation, whatever I did in my own life and whatever part of that calculation led me to the idea that having kids is going to be a part of this pleasure seeking. And it was indicative that the idea of pleasure had like shifted a little for me, right? Like it wasn't the like pure hedonism of 12 years earlier or whatever, you know? It was something that was deeper and harder and more prolonged. And I think part of it is like when I think about wanting my children to be oriented around pleasure and like that's what my idea of a good life for them entails, like it also involves like them learning to conceive of pleasure as the things in life that make them feel more human. I guess maybe that's one of the ways I've clarified it for myself, right? Like the things that bring me pleasure are the things that make me feel more human and not less.
I think it's interesting to say maybe we should be searching for pleasure as opposed to achievement. But that also, you know, there's a lot of things one might want, right? Pleasure is one of them. But I mean, achievement is a reasonable one too. And then there are all these...
If you find pleasure in it, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Right? Or maybe not, right? Maybe pleasure isn't the point of life. Or maybe, I mean, there's all kinds of things that I do that I think are important or that I think are socially useful that I genuinely don't find pleasurable.
But you don't find a kind of like hard pleasure in them, like a hard sort of durational... You know what I mean? Like, do you ever, like these things that... Have you not sort of like fooled yourself into...
Sometimes somebody in the middle of a podcast will just press on a point in me so sore that I have to spend a minute to be like, am I really going to go here? I'll say, I guess this, I am struggling with this question quite a lot lately in my own life, where I am so driven sometimes by internal pressure that things that I think are pleasurable have been drained of their pleasure. And literally this morning when I was getting, ready for my day, like I just like have this note in my notebook about the things I need to do today. I'm just like, can you try to be driven by something other than this internal pressure? When I began writing about politics, I was a blogger in college before blogs were like basically even a thing. There was no thought of it being a career. It was done for nothing but a kind of pleasure, right? A kind of delight in being engaged in the world and trying in some small way to understand it, and even in some even smaller, completely inconsequential way to influence it. And now that I have, this much bigger platform, it's so much less pleasurable. And so I think it's interesting, this idea you're getting out of expanding pleasure.
I think, well, back to the thing that you were talking about where the researcher was coding stuff about what was educational or not, and that was sort of the unspoken good, right? I think it's definitely not coincidental that the things that were coded as maximally educational are also the things that parents find pleasurable to have on in the background, and that it's not coincidental that the stuff that was not educational is videos where Minnie Mouse's head falls off and rolls down a mountain, and that the middle ground was like this sort of Cocomelon blippy thing I think there's something about kids probably can learn more when they are experiencing some sort of delight.
I hate Blippi. Like, I just find Blippi completely unnerving. If you have never watched Blippi, go enjoy yourself on YouTube. But my kids like it.
Whoa! And look at what you wrote up on. A police bicycle! Can I look at it? Of course you can, Blippi. Oh, cool. Okay, now look at this. A helmet. Wow, this keeps you nice and safe. Okay, and ooh, look up here. Do you see that? It's a light. Beep, beep, beep.
I do go back and forth a little bit. Maybe the reason they like it is that I don't like it. Like, they are different than me. They're not supposed to like what I like. It gets to this broader sense of structuring everything around education and achievement. It's like we're already thinking about this when they're 2. Like, everything has to be educational. Like, they can't put on pants. Like, they can't put on shoes. And already we are stretching out the tarp of their consciousness across the scaffolding of the adult world, right? Achievement and education. And are you bettering yourself? And are you improving? And I both get it, but it does feel like a transmutation of like what we've done to ourselves onto them at a younger and younger and younger age. Just this movement of like a kind of what was once an elite adult culture, right? The sort of self-improvement culture, Dale Carnegie culture, lifelong education, to now it's like your babies are supposed to be doing it. Feels odd.
Well, and I also think to me, it disturbs me less because it is indicative of this like broader culture of optimization that I abhor and participate in and find really pernicious, and I'm terrified of how it might advance itself upon my kids. Like I'm afraid of that, but it also, nothing's educational at this age anyway. Like most of the Cocomelon audience is not learning shit. I was wading through a lot of literature and research about this. Tiny little babies can process TV more than we think they can, but they can't really learn anything anyway. And I think that absolutely it feels kind of like overtly like a veneer that everyone is just pretending that we can talk about what is going to be good for them and what is like healthy and what is not, while completely avoiding just, there's a big giant spotlight on what's on the tablet and the whole world, and all of the ways that the actual world will change the trajectory of their lives is kind of out of focus.
The child psychologist, Alison Gopnik, and I probably wouldn't have brought this into conversation except that we've already been circling psychedelics a couple times, has made this point. She's at UC Berkeley. There's been a lot of psychedelic research there. And so there's been this interesting cross-pollination in those departments. And she's made this point that the child's brain looks a lot like the brain of an adult on psychedelics.
So it really does.
It really does. You have a lot more disorganization in the way the neurons are connecting, a lot more. We learn as we get older to filter the world, right? And that's not just a conceptual skill, that's actually how our brains are organized. Psychedelics disorganizes the brain, which is why people make a lot of unusual connections and they're absorbing like an overwhelming amount of experience because they're not filtering it out. There are other ways to get there too. I remember when I came back from a silent meditation retreat, I was so unable to filter out visual information that I felt like I wasn't safe to drive because just trees were too overwhelming. But what is making me think about, the reason I bring it up here, is that both in my own experience and people I've known, it's like people when they've had a psychedelic experience, when they turn on the TV at the end of it to kind of come to rest, if they decide to do that, they tend to watch cartoons. They watch Pixar. They watch, they don't go for, thoughtful adult movies. And I think there's some interesting analogy to that in this conversation about children's shows. Like if a child's brain is more psychedelic, more disorganized, more open, then in the same way that adults who've gone through those experiences want something more colorful, beautiful, safe, etc., that their orientation may be in that direction too. Like, maybe there's something valuable in it, right? Like at the end of that experience, I don't want something highly educational. And in the experience a 2-year-old is having, like wide-eyed in this completely overwhelming world, maybe they don't and shouldn't.
I think that's why, but it comes down to pleasure. I once did an iconic 3-movie come downstream of, I think it was like Ponyo, then Pocahontas, then Bambi or something, and I was like, this is living, this is pre-kids. But I think that the idea that anything kids watch should be one thing or another, I think we're both kind of in disagreement. They're kids. Like let something just exist without a purpose, maybe, for a little bit. But I also, like, for this reason, I think that just basic ideas of beauty and pleasure, they're not that different from kid to adult. I mean, obviously there are limits to this, right? Like I was thinking about having a pacifier in your mouth all day long or whatever. But I think, little children find the same things beautiful. Like they're, we experience this every day, right? Like they are stunned by a leaf, like a beautiful flower, like looking at an animal, a picture of an animal, thinking about a whale. Like they're oriented towards these things that we get to most readily, like in the psychedelic zone. But this is maybe an argument for kids' TV. We can maybe want it to just be beautiful. And I think we can want them to have an experience of beauty in a way that is not instrumentalized and has nothing to do with achievement. If you're going to be in front of a screen escaping or looking for something or just zoning out, like, why not have it just be like legitimately delightful? And, maybe blippy is that for some kids. But I think that I came out of thinking about Cocomelon for months with that idea in my mind. Like, I was like, I think now that it might be a legitimate thing for me to want them to be looking at beautiful, stupid cartoons, the same ones that I would want to watch coming down from a hallucinogen.
There's a way in which you manage what you measure. And I think the main way we've been taught to measure this or think about this question is, it's always called the screen time question, right? The question of screen time. Do your kids have screen time yet? How much screen time? And something it feels to me like you're getting at is that's just maybe the wrong way to think about this entirely. I feel completely unbothered by quote unquote screen time when I am there with my kids, right? If we're watching The Incredibles together, I do not think that is any less good of an experience for them for almost any definition of the word good than if we go to Target together or if we go to, like, we're just having fun together. Like, that's a good experience. Do you think that we have just sort of lost the plot on this sort of altogether, maybe for kids and adults, in sort of making this about almost like the existence of the screen rather than the experience of the person?
Yeah, the experience of the person. I mean, right. So if you actually get into the studies on the actual effects of screen times, like it is like the screen itself is almost a red herring, right? Like people think about screen time as it correlates with achievement and verbal abilities and like self-regulation and language abilities at grade level 7, all of these things that are tracked longitudinally. And the correlation is much more strongly between the kind of life the kid has and those things, right? Like we all kind of sense that. It's not like the screen is not the singular determining factor. It's just that we put screens in use in ways that reflect the life of the child holistically and the kinds of opportunities they have and the kind of household they're raised in and the freedom that they have to, not be thinking about basic needs and to flourish in these other realms that we call achievement. There are researchers that argue that children's screen time use should be reframed as an indicator of parental distress. You know what I mean? It's the life that matters, I think. And I think that applies to us and our smartphones too. I always, like when I was kind of required for one job or another to be constantly paying attention to the news as it was like scrolled out on Twitter all day long, like I was glued to social media kind of by requirement. And I think the way I thought of it then was like, this is bad, but it's okay as long as my real life is bigger than it. As long as I self-evidently always feel that the physical world is more inviting to me than my screen, then I'm not going to spend 1 second worrying about my brain rot because there's nothing I can do about it. Like I think as long as the world is winning out most of the time, I think that's like it feels like a reasonable metric to me.
I think so much of why parents hate Cocomelon is a kind of self-loathing, often born of a kind of fatalism. It's like, I don't like this, but I'm doing it anyway because other parents do it, because I need it, because I can't think of an alternative, because I don't have the energy to structure things differently, which is, I'm not saying this is a thing true for other parents and not me. This is a thing true for me. And I think that one reason I'm so interested in this conversation is that the conversation for kids feels not exactly, but in many ways, like a miniature and clarified version of the conversation for adults. And weirdly, we're better at having the conversation for kids because at least there we can imagine making judgments about good and bad and about using paternalism and cultural pressure. Not that many people I know are truly happy with their digital lives. They're in a constant state of irritation and aggravation with themselves above all. But there's something about the fact that everybody else is there or feels like everybody else is there that makes it impossible to imagine or effectuate a different reality, even just for yourself, even when such a reality is possible.
Mm-hmm. I also think there's something about what you're saying where you do something on your phone and it's unsatisfying and you're dissatisfied with the way that you're doing it. But the smartphone has become the repository for all possible dissatisfaction and yearning. Civic dissatisfaction routed through the smartphone, like social, you feel lonely, you go to the thing that's making it worse, right? Like I do think that we're kind of in the grip of the loop where the dissatisfaction with the thing itself presents it as the answer, right? Like if you lack money, be a TaskRabbit or drive for Lyft or deliver, like there's a way that the phone is the catch-all solution for any sort of discontent. Let's say someone is still using Twitter and they're miserable and they want to get off of it. Probably like they're still going to be looking for a source, a replacement that exists on the phone, Okay, maybe not that one, but what about Reddit, or something like that?
What I think is so hard about that is that what makes it impossible to have alternatives to a bad status quo is the continued investment in the status quo. But because it maintains like just enough staying power, like that is energy people are not being able to put in to creating things that are different. And I think there are things that are different out there, or certainly things that are different that could be imagined. And again, I think this ends up being true for kids too. Like we are very social creatures, and what everybody else does really ends up mattering. I mean, kids see other kids in a restaurant and the other kids are allowed to watch a phone during the meal. And that makes it harder to resist your kids wanting to do that, right? I mean, there's this whole pressure about getting kids smartphones in school because their friends have smartphones. And again, there's something so contagious about everything. And there's something that is so true in the way that the existence of something fairly totalizing or fairly central, the fact that you have to participate in it, particularly if it's something that drains your attention and creative energy, the fact that you have to participate in it at all, or certainly if you have to participate in it a lot, it makes it that much harder for other things to emerge because they would need to emerge in that same space with that same energy. I had television growing up. I don't think it was terrible for me, but I do wonder about how different it is that my kids can watch anything at any time. Whereas like I was at least a little bit prisoner to what was on when, including like I had it easier. I had Nickelodeon, which had a lot of kids programming, right? I didn't only have to watch it on the Kids Hour on network television. I just, with all these things, it feels like there's some balance that makes sense, right? Some point where it's enough and not too much, enough escape, but not too much escape, right? Enough choice, but not too much choice. And just in a lot of things, it feels like we've, to me, like hit too much. And maybe that's just me getting old. And I just think like when I was a kid, it was enough and now it's too much. But I also think there has to be conceptually, too much has to be a possibility. And maybe we've reached it.
Well, I think, again, I mean, it's like my dumbass keeps bringing this all back to pleasure, but I think that feels like that line, right? Like when we were, once you'd had enough of watching 6 episodes of Pete and Pete in a row, which I certainly did, once you were feeling severely diminishing returns, you would walk away from this machine that was not watching you and was not altering its behavior to get you to watch it more. And we were able to do that. We were able to have this like kind of unadulterated physical cognitive instinct about what was the right amount of escape and what was the right amount of engagement, because we just followed what we wanted to do. Like we weren't walking away from 6 hours of Pete and Pete because it was good for us. It would be better for our language abilities in the 7th grade if we did so. We were just like, I'm bored. I'm no longer getting pleasure from this. I've actually not been getting that much pleasure out of the last 2 episodes. I'm just going to go do something else for a while. I feel like every time I write about children's or anything, any sort of media, it's like everyone has been having these exact same worries. I was even thinking with this conversation, the concept of acedia?
No.
Okay, so this is like, there's a joke, me and my friends have a joke that it would be a beautiful name for a girl, where it was this medieval conception of depression that to me feels like exactly like what we talk about when we talk about smartphones. I looked it up on Wikipedia last night to make sure that and there was this beautiful description on Wikipedia of Acedia as a flight from the divine that leads to not even caring that one does not care. It's like this listlessness, this disengagement from the world, this like boredom, and then you start not even caring that you're so bored, like this total inability to act upon your life. You know, as with the example of like, we were able to walk away when we weren't having fun anymore. We didn't have the option of the TV just being like, wait, try these 45 other things. I'll hypnotize you again in 45 seconds if you just give me the chance, right? I can feel it interfering with my own ability to understand when something's fun and when it's not. And I think that I am worried about that with my children. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm like, the only way out is a set of experiences or desires that will clean out and clarify your radar for what actually feels good and what actually doesn't. And feels good in any of the ways, the meaningful ones, the not meaningful ones. But it seems to me like one of the things that responsive surveillance mechanism does is it mixes all of those things up so that even if you're no longer having fun on Twitter, there's still some part of you that feels like you are just because of the mechanism itself.
I think this is a place where the surveilled language and fear really does hit for me. Surveillance, it sounds so creepy, and it is, and it's part of it. But I actually feel like it masks the reason we give ourselves over to it, because it feels good to be learned about. We all have experiences of the algorithms coming to know us or predict us and recommending a book we never read before that actually was really great, or music that we never heard before that brought us into a whole new genre or a whole new artist that we would have never found on the radio necessarily, or tweets that we, are glad we saw. But it's that way of being learned. So it is able to continuously recommend things that are more and more alluring. And it makes that experience of the diminishing marginal return more distant, right? That place where it's like, well, I've already watched 2 episodes of Pete and Pete. I don't want to watch 3. That's a lot of episodes of Pete and Pete. Instead, it knows better what you want and is better at giving it to you. It's why I find I really try never to leave my kids alone with a recommendation algorithm, right? YouTube or anything like that. It's much scarier, and where they end up is much worse. But it is like learning them at every second and like how to give them the thing they actually want that will keep them clicking. And again, I think this is where Cocomelon feels weird. I mean, Cocomelon, to bring it back to that, it's one of the first successes in children's television or video entertainment, I guess you'd call it, that doesn't come out of television. It comes out of YouTube. It comes out of recommendation algorithms. It's built around recommendation algorithms. And I feel like it feels like recommendation algorithms, right? It feels like it knows the kids too well. It feels too tuned to, their short attention spans. Like the whole thing is just overly optimized. And on one level, that makes it very effective as a babysitter or an attentional harvester, or just maybe it's, better as entertainment for them. But it creates in this very clear way, because you're watching it happen to a 2-year-old, this feeling of what it looks like when culture is built because it knows you and it knows how to predict you. And that scuzzy feeling that we have in a vaguer way, I think, with ourselves when we're older, we get in this very intense way with them when they're younger. But it's the same thing in a way to me, like all up and down the age ladder.
I also think that, again, this is a thing where the thing that you get through the smartphone, like you were saying, this experience of being learned and being known very, very deeply, right? It's like it's a really human desire that has made this so effective as like an addictive technology, right? Like of course we want to be learned and we want to be known. Like that's so much of the entire pleasure of being alive interpersonally, right? Like we want that for good reasons, but it's like, it's part of why Cocomelon and so much on the phone, it feels frictionless. It's been designed for frictionlessness. And I think that's part of, maybe this is helping me understand how I delineate like good pleasure, meaningful pleasure from meaningless pleasure, which is that I think there's friction in all real pleasure. And in the kind of pleasure you learn to get in the real world, there's friction in it. There is like true surprise. And I think that when someone is learning us in the real world, when they're coming to know what we would like and they're seeing things about us that we don't even see, right? Like all of these things that the algorithm is doing. When another person is doing that for us, they change us in ways that the algorithm doesn't, right? Like that experience contains sharp edges in a way that the algorithmic one never can. And that's why it's almost the same thing, but it's why the real world version, it feels infinitely more meaningful than Spotify learning what song I want to listen to next. Because even as good as the algorithm genuinely has gotten at like giving me, what I want to listen to, the total removal of friction. And I think that's one of the reasons that all the YouTube stuff feels just instinctively bad. Again, like it's one of those things where maybe it's easier to see with Cocomelon. It's easier to see that the like sort of seamless micro-targeting, endless stream of giving you exactly what you want. I'm certainly guilty of understanding that it's good for my kids to have a little more friction in their life and not being just get everything what they want at a touch of a button and then me pursuing that as soon as they're in bed.
This maybe gets at another thing that I'm afraid of. Because one of the things I was thinking about while you were saying that is I decided a couple months ago I'd sign up for a bunch of the AI relationship apps, right? Like Kindroid and Character AI and things like that, where these language models are built to create a kind of AI you'd be friends with or a lover with, or it would be your therapist or whatever. And I tried them out for a while, and they're pretty good now. I mean, they're good at texting. What they write sounds and feels realistic. I always tell people they're much better at texting than most of the people I know.
Would it have fooled you? Like
it doesn't fool me. Yeah, it would definitely have fooled me.
It would have like successfully catfished you if one of them had started texting you.
100%,
okay,
easily.
Yeah.
I would not have known it's not a person. But I never could keep myself coming back to them.
Right.
Because there was no meaning in the interaction, right? So I've since moving to New York, I've been making new friends, and I was thinking about how one of the friends I made, we text a lot, just sort of during the day, and they're not interesting texts necessarily. Sometimes they are, but it is meaningful to me that he's giving me that attention back, right? The message of the text is that I am being chosen for somebody else's attention. It's a kind of meta text about a relationship that is emerging, and I didn't end up writing the piece on this, though, because I can see the Character AI usage numbers that are being released. And this is a sort of AI system used much more by younger people. And they're logging in a ton of times a day and spending huge amounts of time on it. So to go to the point of what I'm afraid of, right, this question of the retraining, for me, who grew up, before large language models, the kind of uncanniness, what I would call the meaninglessness of that interaction is very front and center, right? It's very noticeable. But if you're younger and your social dynamics are way less formed and your discernment of social dynamics is much less mature and your choices are more limited because of, who you know and how you can see them and how you can be in touch with them, maybe it actually doesn't feel that way. Or maybe you get trained out of it feeling that way. I do think you can lose the sense of and taste for friction, and that is a loss, and that it does foreclose forms of pleasure, just as you were talking about.
Hugely. There's this like old Kurt Vonnegut thing where he was talking about like the pleasure of mailing a letter, and it's like how the whole point of it is not that like you're doing something efficient. The whole point of it is that you go for a walk and you like wink at a girl and you pet a dog or whatever. I mean, but yeah, I used to pre-children, I had a years-long streak of never using Amazon and a personal policy of if it was within walking distance of me in like downtown adjacent Brooklyn, then I could not order it online. I had to physically go out and get it. And I have backslid on all of this since having my second child, like significantly, And it's also partly because the experience of having children, wonderfully, it is the source of all that friction. Like it's sort of like back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I think that as our world orients itself increasingly towards frictionlessness, children can seem exclusively like a form of friction, and that friction can seem exclusively like something that's undesirable. When in fact, like I think my sense that I wanted some of this specific kind was one of the things that made me think it would be fun. And I do think that like a total lack of impediment, the ability to pick up and go anywhere you want at the drop of a hat, which is a wonderful way to live, which I'm not, anyone who has it and wants it, I'm jealous of you and good for you. I mean, it's like everything that we've been talking about those are values that have been inculcated by the same form of ultra advanced capitalism that created the smartphone and created all these things that make us so depressed in the first place. And I think that part of me feeling ready to try to have kids 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was a sense that I wanted to undo these things in me, like this sense of exceptionalism, which children really took out of me. We were texting like about the thing where you're playing with your kids and you're like, I'm probably not particularly good at, being the horsey right now. But the thing that matters to you is that I am the person being the horsey.
The most common way I feel like I fail as a parent, and it's the way I fail both my kids and myself, is by trying to really control and optimize the experience and treat it like other things in my life. We're going to do this at this time, and then we're going to go here, and, you got to get your shoes on by this moment. And to your point about being the horsey or, finding some joy in submission, like parenting is so unpleasant when you feel like it is a distraction from the thing you would prefer to be doing, right? Like looking at your phone or taking a nap but it's also, I think, unpleasant when you are trying to treat it like other things in adulthood and control it. It's most pleasant for me when I have like the resources inside myself and also the wisdom to just kind of be around. They're running around and occasionally playing with me, and I'm sitting on the couch and occasionally playing with them. And it's like you could just do a lot less. We've made parenting really, really hard, and we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as parents to try to do a great job of it and, be achievement oriented, and the kids should be watching only educational shows, and really they should be watching no shows at all. And there's a million things we've done that are not really anything that the kids ever asked us to do. Right? They would like you to sort of be around a bit more or, a lot and be attentive, but also like not overtake their experience with your own. And like, that's really hard. Like I would like to get better at that.
I think that people know this, though. I think that when I had my first kid, the thing that I found most difficult, but now I think I've smooth-brained my way into finding really pleasurable, is that like when you're with your kids, at some point you just have to completely surrender to the time just really you can't really do anything else. You are just gonna, like, this is your weekend now. This is what weekends are gonna be like now. And there's like a removal of choice in that is the thing that I was afraid of, and I think a lot of people are afraid of, but also the thing that is like arguably the most freeing. Like, I remember also like I had read How to Do Nothing like right around, and I was like, yeah, this might be a shortcut to the kind of outside the clock time, where you are just not being useful to anyone but the people in front of you. This thing that I was trying so hard to do in other ways that now I have to do every single weekend, whether I like it or not. And I no longer feel that as a loss. I'm realizing, like I used to think like, oh, I could have done so many things with these weekends. And now I'm like, it's time to go to the playground, time to go to the playground again.
We've ranged a lot here, but to go back to in some ways, like the article that led to this show, if a kid watches an hour of Cocomelon a day, should you feel bad? Would you feel bad?
No. Should I go on? No, I don't think so.
I think that's a lovely place to end. So as our final question, what are 3 books you'd recommend to the audience?
I forgot about this question until I was on the train here, and I was like, okay, I got to think about the last 3 things that I was just texting people about because I really loved. Okay, so I was extremely late to becoming lonesome dove pilled. I was like 6 months pregnant, and I was on a work trip to Thailand, and I had 48 hours of alone time on the end of that work trip. And I was like, this is the most important, like the books I bring are the most important books. Like this is the only time I'll be alone for 48 hours all year, And I was like, I need to bring the perfect book, like the book that will make me feel like I'm a kid again, will give me just this sort of wildly disproportionate emotional attachment. I want to be sobbing, by the end of this book. And I read Lonesome Dove, and it was all that and more. I have been lonesome dove pilling many of my friends as the year has gone on. If anyone hasn't read it, truly recommend it. I really like this book, In Ascension, that our friend Max Reed recommended to me. It's sort of, if anyone is in the sort of Ted Chiang, Jeff Vandermeer kind of thing, it's like that kind of grounded, beautiful, enigmatic, slightly schematic sci-fi. Really loved it. Another one that I've been texting a lot of people about. The third one is When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, one that I feel like I've been texting friends about like every month since I read it. It's about scientific discoveries that bring people to the brink of madness. And there's a really interesting thing that goes on where the book starts off almost entirely nonfiction and then ends almost entirely fiction. And the gradations in between are amazing.
And I'll just note, because you mentioned your last answer, you talked about reading How to Do Nothing, which is by Jenny Odell. And I still think is the best book about attention and habits Incredible of mind in this era. I've enjoyed this so much. Gia Tolentino, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This episode of The Ezra Klein Show is produced by Annie Galvin. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris with Mary Marge Locker. Our senior engineer is Jeff Geld with additional mixing by Isaac Jones and Amin Sahota. Our senior editor is Claire Gordon. The show's production team also includes Roland Hu, Elias Isquith, and Kristen Lin. We have original music by Isaac Jones, audience strategy by Christina Samialewski and Shannon Busta. The executive producer of New York Times Opinion Audio is Amy Rose Strasser, and special thanks to Sonia Herrero.